Bishop Andre asked me how I'm doing. Oh, nice. God bless him. All right, so welcome everybody to our second episode of Lord of Spirits Study Guide. We are very happy to be on live today with YouTube and Zoom. For those of you who know the codes, you can join up. We just started the beginning of the episode Antichrist, Devil's Children last week. We didn't get too far into it because I did a kind of a longer introduction to the whole topic of eschatology. What is eschatology? So we're going to review all of that. But tonight and through this, even the second half of the episode, and again, remember, Lord of Spirits podcast episodes are 3 halves, not just 2. A lot of the time is taken up looking through the second chapter of 2 Thessalonians. And we're going to be looking just tonight, probably, I'm just going to cut it off at the end of the first half. So we're done with that. And it's nice and concise, which will just be about this verse here. We've already talked a bit about it. So to review, first of all, eschatology comes from the Greek word eschaton, for the last things, i.e. the end times. So any type of eschatology has to do with the end times. That being said, sometimes it doesn't have to do necessarily with the end of time. It could be the last things kind of intruding into the present. Every divine liturgy has an eschatological element in which we remember the second and glorious coming of Christ. And it's a sense that you're entering into that timeless state or space where the angelic liturgy is taking place, which you see in the book of Revelation. So that's not just things that are happening at the end of time, but those are things happening in the heavenly realms throughout or beyond time itself, really, as we understand it.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
1 point in, here we go.
So can it apply to more mundane things than, the big divine things? Can eschatology also refer to like individuals' life?
I think yes, and I think you'll see why as we go through this. But in particular, the point of all of these things, clearly stated over and over, by the way, by the New Testament authors, is not to say, "Don't worry, you have time. These are the things that are going to happen, and when they happen, then you really actually have to worry." They never say that. They always say, be ready, be prepared, treat it like something imminent. And that's kind of the point. Like, effectively, we are all living in our end times, right? Because we could die tomorrow. So we could die tonight, right? And then where whose will those things be that we work so hard together, right? But so yeah, this definitely, the goal is to see how you can apply it to your personal life. We talked about the parousia, or the presence, what we often translate it as Christ's arrival or his coming again. But again, that term parousia has that quality of just simply being present. It's closely connected, as we'll see, with epiphania, with his appearing, and that's what we call a theophany, not just an epiphany in English. We began to speak about what Antichrist means. Remember that Antichrist does not mean against Christ per se, like I'm anti-Christ. It literally meant in place of or instead of Christ, like antipasto is in place of pasta. So the Antichrist comes with Parmesan shredders, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Oops. But no, he will be against the Christ because he will be attempting to take the place of Christ. But when we understand what is an Antichrist, sometimes these things don't appear visibly trying to be against religion or against faith. Sometimes they're subverting it so that something else is in the place of Christ.
That's very different. This concept I hadn't thought of. Antichrist and king,
Yeah.
opposite of Christ is different from instead of Christ.
Yeah.
But then,
yeah, and we're going to look at how that works in this.
Sorry again.
Sure.
I was thinking though, like a Greek tragedy in the way that it's actually written, they had a strophe, the chorus had a strophe and then an antistrophe. And in the strophe, they would have a dance step going in one direction, and in the antistrophe, it would go in the opposite direction. So how does that, because that almost seems like against rather than in place of.
Yeah, well, that could be a different use of it, but it's also got the quality of counter. Not necessarily, it's not going against, it's just going in a different direction. So that's like in that way instead of that way, I guess. It's one way to look at it. So it's not always used as against. This is my point. Like Antipascha is the Sunday after Pascha because St. Thomas wasn't there. He was there the next Sunday. So that was his in place of Pascha. That's why it's called that. We looked at the word apostasia, the great rebellion or apostasy that's talked about, the great falling away. We talked about it in terms of how the connection to military concepts and terminology, that a big part, and we're going to see this throughout this whole episode, the idea of military positioning, right? We are here present, standing our ground for Christ, and this apostasy will be like people leaving their post, people defecting to the other side, people, running away, deserting. So it's not simply just limited to a kind of a typical sense of rebellion. Person doesn't actually have to actively rebel to participate in this. All they have to do is decide, I'm not going to show up anymore, right? I'm gonna essentially leave my post. All right, so tonight we're going to look at the second half of this one verse. Man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction. So who is this man of lawlessness and what is the son of destruction? First of all, let's talk about the use of the word man itself, because this is important when you're dealing with this. Because of course, when we're talking about Antichrist, people tend to want to pinpoint Antichrist as it's this one person at this one point in history. And there have been wonderful candidates for the job throughout history, of course. And there's even fictional characters who have done a bang-up job presenting the Antichrist. But when we talk about the man of lawlessness, we're using a term in Greek, anthropos, which of course you know this term because you probably heard about anthropology, right? Or there's a store called Anthropology, isn't there? Yeah, you can buy perfume or something there. This is the type of language that's used, for example, where Pontius Pilate says, "Behold the man," the anthropos. Anthropos means both a singular man, maybe, but kind of the man, plus mankind as a general. So for us, men and for our salvation, in the creed, for example, uses anthropos as its root, and it's talking about this, not just us individually, but us as a species, right? Oops. Hello, don't do that. Come back. You can see this exists in Hebrew and in Greek, by the way. In Hebrew, we have Adama, from which we get, of course, who? No, the guy from Battlestar Galactica, Admiral Adama. Adam, yes. Adam is Adama, and that means man in the same sense of anthropos, whereas Ish is kind of like a guy, a male, a dude, a man, a husband, for example. Similar in Greek, you have anthropos, but you also have this word anir, which is more specific, like a specific person, a husband, a male. And you see that these are used differently from each other to a certain extent. That anthropos, that Adama, has this quality of including the whole. Other examples of how this kind of language works in the scriptures, for example, in John 3, there is the word anothen used. Unless you are born again, you'll by no means see the kingdom of heaven. But it could also be translated, if you are not born from above, which obviously has a much different nuance, especially when you're kind of seeing it through the filter of modern day American evangelicalism, right? So literally it means from the top. So take it from the top. That's what it means. So born again, but born from above, do it over, kind of like the whole idea. It can be used both this in time and in space kind of way. And so there's a lot of terms that have these dual qualities, which the point of them maybe is that it's probably both. Both are true. You know, it's Greek is fun with that. So is Hebrew. American English tends to be a lot less nuanced and a lot more picky. And of course, it's getting pickier every day. If we looked at how anthropos is used in the New Testament, for example, the important passages in Romans 5. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one anthropo, one through man, and death through sin, so also death was passed on to all men, anthropine, because all sinned. So it's again not about individual men, but mankind as a whole, from single to group. So the man of lawlessness is the anthropos anomius. This now, if you compare this, there is the first man through whom sin and death came into the world, Adam. And there's the second man, who's Christ, the new Adam, but there is a third Adam, if you will, who kind of plays this role, the anthropos anomius, the lawless man, who is different than Adam, different than Christ, has his type through a number of figures in the Old Testament, first of which would be Cain, right? The first, remember, if you remember my class, and if you've heard Lord of Spirits podcast, you know, Adam is not necessarily considered the prototypical sinner. He is the source of the fall, yes, but the real kind of sinner figure is Cain, right? The murderer, the one who brings violence into the world. And figures like that become connected to this. This anthropos anomius, this lawless man, embodies the lawlessness of the world archetypally. Sometimes you'll see it translated as man of sin, but that's not what the Greek is saying, right? It's sin is armatia, but man without nomos is what this is literally saying, which we'll look at what that means in a second. But man of sin is used because, after all, 1 John 3:4 says, whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. So they kind of figure, well, we'll just say man of sin and shorten the translation, I guess. But I don't recommend doing that with this, because you're going to see why, because there's a lot going on with this term anomius and lawlessness.
But how could the rest of them be one person? I mean, it's not equivalent to Adam, Christ, and then that's a type.
Yeah, they're type of person, right? So Adam is like our relapsarian humanity. Christ is our transfigured humanity. In between is this humanity that's struggling, and out of it rises this man of law, this humanity of lawlessness. So yes, it's an individual and a group kind of representation at the same time, if you will. So, oops. Anomius. Father Stephen DeYoung, I heard him say breaking the law. So I assume he was quoting Judas Priest. No one said it out loud, but that's, I assume, what he was quoting. This comes from the Greek word nomos. A in front of it is like not, right? So not having, or not being, or without. So anomios is without law, but nomos itself means something more than just law. Like, it's not just, well, when we think of law today, we normally think of a very specific set of kind of legal proceedings, rules, constitutions, documents. That's what law is. It's this formalized, encapsulated institution. In the ancient world, this idea of nomos, or law, was far more reaching than simple kind of legal precedents and so forth. It kind of has the meaning of way, the way of the Greeks, or the way of the Hebrews. Sometimes it's opposed in the Greek philosophers between, like, what the way of your culture versus the way of nature, or the natural, what we would call today natural law. Like, and you have these arguments, right? Nature versus nurture. Mm-hmm. And the answer is yes. It's always both, right? Hebrew also, when it talks about the Torah, we translate that as the law, because in the Greek it says the nomos. But again, the Torah means so much more than just a group of rules, right? The Torah is the whole narrative, the whole story, the whole culture, the whole ritual, liturgical life, all the things that kind of come out of the Pentateuch. So it means the way. And early Christians, of course, understood what they were doing as a fulfillment of the way, and they considered themselves followers of the way. That's what they were called before they were called Christians, which is actually kind of a semi-slur. It was like little Christs. Jerome used the similar Latin word lex, which again we associate with law in the modern sense, but lex, even in the ancient Latin sense, had this broader understanding. For example, you'll hear in church a Latin kind of maxim that's often used, lex orandi, lex credendi. The rule of prayer is the rule of faith, or the way of prayer is the way of faith. So it's not saying the laws about prayer, the rule, the specific documented kind of prescriptive rules, right, about prayer is what the doctrine is. That's not what that's saying. It's saying how you live your life of prayer. That's what faith really is. So this broader understanding is this man of lawlessness will be someone who has eschewed the Torah, someone who has eschewed the way of God and the way of God's people willfully. He is, in fact, a yokeless Belial. Who is Belial, and what does yokelessness have to do with it? Well, when we look for things like man of lawlessness in Second Temple literature or in Old Testament literature, we find this figure of Belial. In Greek, you'll see it said Beliar for some reason. I don't know why. But what it means in both Aramaic and in the Talmudic Hebrew, yokeless one. Sometimes you see it translated as worthless or corrupt, naughty. There's some very fun translations. Naughty from quite literally because it is like naught. It has nothing of value. That's what the word naughty means. So naughty doesn't actually mean you're misbehaving. It just means you're worthless. So if you call your kids naughty, it really is mean. It's like you are like nothing. So don't call your kids naughty. Maybe call them mischievous or something a little more with room for growth. In Deuteronomy, and this is one of those things where this hides then in plain sight. This concept hides in plain sight in English translations. For example, in Deuteronomy 13:13, corrupt men, all right, well, corrupt men. But what it's actually saying is men of lawlessness, Belial, have gone out from among you and enticed the inhabitants of their city, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known. In the Sanhedrin, which is part of the Talmudic literature, they interpret this passage to reference the Bene Belial as an abbreviation of Abanim Belial, sons who have cast off the yoke. So Belial is yokeless. Instead of lawless, right? They're not the men of Torahlessness. They're the men of yokelessness, because the yoke is the symbol of that guiding way, right? I take upon this yoke, not egg yolk, but like an animal, and through working that, I pull the plow. And I do the work. So they have cast off the yoke of heaven from their necks. The yoke of heaven is the Torah. And in Jubilees, which we've talked about in our Discovering the Religion of the Apostles class, also known as Secondary Genesis. It's a midrashic commentary in the Second Temple period on Genesis. That's very influential in the early church. Jubilees in chapter 1, Moses prays over the people and says, let thy mercy, O Lord, be lifted up upon thy people. Create in them an upright spirit, and let not the spirit of Belial rule over them, to accuse them before thee and to ensnare them from all the paths of righteousness, so that they may perish from before thy face. Once again, this is getting into that cosmology of the ancient world, in which things like morality are not simply abstract concepts. They reflect personal spiritual forces at work in the world. And so this spirit of lawlessness, spirit of Belial, is a kind of like what Jonathan Pajot might call a higher order of agency in the world, that goes beyond the personal into this making people or leading people into the wrong direction. So this figure of Belial is actually mentioned in the New Testament, and is hiding all over the place in the Old Testament, and is a huge stand-in name for the devil throughout the Second Temple literature. And we're going to look at some of that tonight.
Is belly any kind of root of leads into the variety of words?
I think the belly is kind of like the without, and then the ol is the yoke, because they have another version, belly yoel, which is without advantage. So yoel would be the advantage. So without yoke or without advantage. Similar concepts, but that's why you see sometimes worthless men or corrupt men or empty, vain men, where it's really saying Belial, the sons of Belial is what it's literally saying in the Hebrew. And they understood Belial. Again, it's not just a concept, but a spiritual being with agency, affecting and afflicting the world. Okay, the Torah is described as a yoke, the yoke of heaven. We could talk about it as the yoke of wisdom, for example. In Sirach, which is part of what the Orthodox Church considers part of the canonical scriptures in the Old Testament, wisdom of Ben Sirach. In Sirach 51, I open my mouth and speak of her. Gain wisdom for yourselves at no cost. Take her yoke upon your neck, that your mind may receive her teaching, for she is close to those who seek her, and the one who is in earnest finds her. So wisdom comes by taking the yoke of asceticism, of self-discipline, of self-control, of pursuing virtue, of purifying your senses, of all the things that will later become part and parcel of what's called the Desert Father tradition in the church, Philocolic tradition as well, that we study here. Sirach chapter 6, my child, from your youth choose discipline, and when you have gray hair you will find wisdom. As though plowing and sowing, draw close to her, then wait for her bountiful crops, right? The yoke imagery is implied in that. For in cultivating her you will work but little, and soon you will eat her fruit. Does that sound familiar to you? Do you know where I'm going with this? Right? You know, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light, right? Christ himself is identified as holy wisdom. That Hagia Sophia, that great church in Constantinople, and the very nice cathedral in DC are not after Saint Sophia, the martyr, but Hagia Sophia is the holy wisdom of Christ. And so he is representing himself here. My yoke is easy, because he's drawing from the language of yoke in the wisdom literature. That wisdom has this yoke that you take upon yourself of discipline so that you can taste the fruit of it, right? So this is where this kind of language is coming from. Neat icon here, by the way. This is the icon of Christ Hagia Sophia. Depicts the kind of the angel of wisdom here, which is a figure of Christ in the Old Testament. We looked at this in our other class too. Okay, so sons of Belial then becomes a term which we'll find again throughout the New Testament and Second Temple literature. Do we have a question online there in the Zoom chat? If not, okay. Jubilees again, 1533. Now I God announce unto thee, Abram, that the children of Israel will not keep true to this ordinance. They will not circumcise their sons according to all this law. For in the flesh of their circumcision, they will omit this circumcision of their sons, and all of them, sons of Belial, will leave their sons uncircumcised as they were born. And there will be great wrath from the Lord against the children of Israel. Now you may say, what's the big deal? We don't worry about that. And if you've taken the class on discovering the religion of the apostles, you know why circumcision has now been, fulfilled to the overflowing in baptism, the cutting off of the whole body and through water. But at this time, this was effectively saying, I don't really care if they're part of the covenant with God. The circumcision was the sign of your connection with Yahweh. And to leave your children uncircumcised, and nobody in the ancient world was saying, well, I'm going to let them decide for themselves when they get older. No, nobody was saying it. They were effectively saying, and they were not saying, I'm not really interested in church either way. They were basically committing these children to other spiritual beings. There wasn't a neutral, empty ground there. So identity was tied to liturgical expressions like circumcision or what the pagans would do for their own children. We talk about this at length in like the class on giant clans or the episode on giants and Lord of Spirits. Yeah. That's why the wrath. I mean, it's not just because they were like, well, I didn't get around to it or something. It's there's always a deeper meaning to this. God's not just some petty, jealous, envious deity or something like that, trying to get revenge. They are committing their children to death, spiritually, and then, of course, physically in some cases. In 1 Samuel 2, the sons of Eli, remember those guys?
Yes.
What's their names? Do you remember?
Oh.
Is it Hophni and Phinehas? Is
Yeah,
that their name? The sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. Now, again, I don't think this means that they were playing like PK, helping their dad, doing priestly things at the tabernacle, and then going to the temple of Belial somewhere. That's not what that means. But what it meant is that they were basically lawless kids, right? They were impious, and they were not observing reverence proper towards God. And in fact, that's what cost them their lives. Eventually, they abuse the role and do what?
Strange fire.
That's the sons of Aaron.
Oh.
They take the ark to fight the Philistines without permission, right? Without the blessing of the Lord, and they die in the battle, and the ark is captured, and that's why David has to come and kind of save the day and all that.
And then Eli dies when he gets the word, right? He falls off the stool. If I get the story,
Eli seemed like he was a nice enough guy. He just didn't do his job well enough, and he suffered immensely. Yeah. I don't remember. That's a good question. It sounds right. It sounds right. Poor guy. This term also appears in the Psalms. And this is interesting because I say this one a lot. This is Psalm 101. If you pray the Psalms, you say this a lot, but liturgically, I use this a lot. I will set nothing wicked before my eyes. That is literally, I will set no Belial before my eyes. I hate the work of those who fall away. It should not cling to me. This prayer was used by Jewish exorcists. It's used in the Orthodox Church for exorcising purposes, especially and most notably in the blessing of a home. When you come to your home to be blessed for the first time, we begin the service with this psalm. And we end the service with this psalm. When I go censing the house after I've washed it and anointed it, baptized it with water and anointed it with oil, then I go through the house with the incense and I chant this psalm. And it's basically an exorcism. I'm casting out the last aspects of, it's it. Censor, demons, get out. And as we see in this, there's actually huge precedent for that in the Old Testament. The idea that the priest with the censer drives out the destroyer. And we'll see that later in this episode. Okay, Father Stephen mentioned in the episode that among the Second Temple literature, Jewish literature that was influential on the New Testament church, even though we talk a lot about, say, First Enoch or Jubilees, and you've heard a lot of that, probably the more influential series of texts were what are called the Testaments of the 12 patriarchs. And they're very they run right into the New Testament period. They're written in that 1st century BC and then even into the 1st century AD, 1st century in the time of Christ. So these works. Now, of course, they're pseudepigraphal in the sense that, they're attributed to these patriarchs back in the time of Jacob's sons, but they were read piously, and you find them in the homes of pious Jews and Christians in those early centuries. So there's so much going on. When they say that the Holy Spirit was like silent, this idea from Daniel to, it's just so not, there's so much generating at that time, and some of it will be included into scripture, and some of it will kind of be included in the okay apocrypha, right? The stuff that you can read but aren't used liturgically in the home. And then there's stuff that will, of course, be just said, no, that's wacky stuff. And rabbinical Judaism will constrict their canon more tightly because they're reacting against Christianity. But this stuff is got stuff where it's Jewish, but it's a lot closer to Christianity. It's too close for comfort for the rabbinical sources. They include it, and they understand, they recognize it as Jewish literature of the time, but they certainly don't give it any authority. And the church doesn't treat it as authoritative either. I'm presenting it to you to demonstrate, again, how these concepts were understood by the people using them at the time. I'm not trying to make an argument here that because Reuben such and such or Issachar such and such said something that you have to believe something. I'm just trying to demonstrate this is how these terms were being used by the people at the time, so that if we want to understand the context, the tradition in which the scriptures are being formed, we need to understand how the people who first read them and heard them would have understood them. Hope that makes sense. Reuben, Testament of Reuben 4. And now this is an interesting thing, because we already kind of talked about discipline with wisdom and the yoke of the law and so forth. Now you see how it's going to get closer into the ethical. For many hath fornication destroyed, because though a man be old or noble or rich or poor, he bringeth reproach upon himself with the sons of men and derision with Beliar or Belial. Therefore the God of your fathers delivered Joseph from every evil and hidden death. Joseph, right, the son of Jacob who went into Egypt. For if fornication overcomes not your mind, neither can Belial overcome you. So this understanding that Joseph, by keeping himself pure, by not giving in to Potiphar's wife, he's this Christ-like image. Also for the 1st century Christians and later, there was this understanding that the sons of wickedness or the sons of lawlessness, the demonic forces of the world, could have power over you if you gave into these kind of sins of the flesh, especially. In Levi 19, choose therefore for yourselves either the light or the darkness, either the law of the Lord or the works of Beliar. And you see the same concept. Joshua, I set before you, right? 2 ways. And that Didache picks that up right away in the 1st century. There are 2 ways, one leading to life, one leading to destruction, etc. So this is part of that language. This is the kind of stuff that you would have seen being used by these 1st century Jewish Christians. They're like, oh yeah, we get this. What Christ is saying is not something totally new. He's just presenting it now in a way that's kind of all fitting together and going beyond. Testament of Issachar. Know ye therefore, my children, that in the last times, eschatological, your sons will forsake singleness. I'm not sure what word that's translating this. If that's monogamy, I'm guessing that's what that's saying, but I'm also thinking chastity might be what's being translated. And will cleave unto insatiable desire, and leaving guilelessness will draw near to malice. And forsaking the commandments of the Lord, they will cleave unto Belial. And leaving husbandry, they will follow after their own wicked devices, and they shall be dispersed among the Gentiles and shall serve their enemies. And again, I'm assuming husbandry here means human husbandry, not animal husbandry. So they are the family life, right? They'll leave behind the raising of children to the Lord and the building up of the nation of the people of God. They will leave that, and because of that, the the nation will be dispersed. It will be dissipated. And again, so this is definitely something that is kind of a take on understanding the history of the people of God, and fits very well then into the Christian concept of ethics.
But so he advocates for monasticism?
No, singleness meaning is monogamy, faithfulness to one wife. And again, monogamy, using the Old Testament image, is closely related to faithfulness to Yahweh. Because the problem with Israel was that it was perpetually committing adultery with the gods of the nations. So the concept of monogamy becomes a symbol for faithfulness, not just to your one wife, but to your one God.
Father,
Yeah.
Father, I had a question because the term Belial sounds a lot like Baal. Is it possible that the god Baal is at all related to this word?
That's a great question, but I don't think it is.
No, I put in the chat, I looked it up when you said it was Deuteronomy 13:13. In the Torah, it's actually 13:14, whatever. Because Belial is written, I put it in the chat here. The first one is Belial, and El is the name, it's God, and that's written with an Aleph. You can see that one letter is different. Baliah, I didn't even notice how the nekudot, the vowels in it, but Belial is the next one. That's written with an Ayin. So Baal is written with an Ayin, I think, is that? No, I think that's actually written with an Aleph. I think Baal is written with an Aleph.
Yeah, A.
So it's not related.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any words in Hebrew that bear a relation to one another, they have the same 3-letter root. And you're missing one of the lameds, the letter that's in there twice in each of those, that's a lamed. You're missing that in Baal. So if it doesn't have the same root, it's not related.
Thank you. Another text from this period, not part of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, but adjacent literature, is called the Ascension of Isaiah, another kind of apocalyptic literature. You know, the prophet has this vision of the heavenly realms and all these things that are taking place. So this is kind of an expansion on what you have in the prophecy of Isaiah, and kind of a further exploration. And in it, very, very explicitly, Belial is identified with Samael, who you might remember from our class on this evil spiritual forces and religion of the apostles, which literally means the venom of God, the destroyer, prince of demons, and who is the main monster in the first Hellboy movie, for that matter, I believe. So for those of you who enjoy Mike Mignola comics and so forth. All right, in chapter 2, Manasseh turned aside his heart to serve Belial for the angel of lawlessness. So Belial's treated as the angel of lawlessness, the Antichrist being the man of lawlessness, the one who has the image of Belial, right? The son of Belial. The angel of lawlessness, who is the ruler of this world, is Belial, whose name is, now here's a new one, Matan Bukas. I could not find any explanation for what Matan Bukas is, except that it is now the name of a malware virus.
Really?
Which is kind of funny, because I consider a lot of the demons to function very much like malware and act like computer viruses, right? The thoughts, intrusive thoughts. Some people try to argue that it might be a version of Ahriman, but that is not even close. It's just one of those weird names that appears in this kind of literature that's never explained elsewhere that I know of. So maybe it appears in some weird Tobin spirit guide or something from Ghostbusters. Anyway, he delighted in Jerusalem because of Manasseh, and he made him strong in apostatizing Israel and in the lawlessness which spread abroad in Jerusalem. So yeah, Belial here, when you see this word Belial, it's not simply corrupt men or worthless men or naughty men. It's talking about men who are sons of a demonic force, a force that is leading people away from God, throwing off the yoke, throwing off the Torah, throwing off the way of life, choosing the path to death. And so you see this concept then, of course, the Lord himself uses this language. Nobody has to go, who are you talking about? So when he says, now is the judgment of this world, now the ruler of this world will be cast out. They weren't saying, does he mean Herod or Augustus, Caesar? Does he mean some king somewhere? They understood the ruler of this world is a demonic force. It's basically the big bad. Now, this is where we get into this interesting term, Belial Adam. In Proverbs 6, a worthless person is the English translation, but the Hebrew is Belial Adam, and a wicked man, Awen Ish. So there's a good use of the Adam for a man, and then another, like the Ish for specific, like a particular. So a worthless man, a Belial Adam, walks with a perverse, or another translation for those of you who know Father Stephen and his love of Old English words, a froward mouth. Froward. He winks with his eyes, he shuffles with his feet, he points his fingers. Perversity is in his heart, he devises evil continually, he sows discord. Therefore his calamity shall come suddenly. Suddenly he shall be broken without remedy, like my stupid foot, which is not broken, but feels like it, because I am too often in Awan Ish. So Belial Adam is essentially a similar concept in Hebrew as man of lawlessness, right? The man of lawlessness. So in Proverbs, sometimes a naughty person. How different this proverb is when you have kind of the first line being Antichrist, an Antichrist-like figure, or somebody in the spirit of Antichrist, a wicked man, versus a naughty person. Exactly. It's kind of like it totally deflates kind of in the modern English. Now, maybe at another time it held weight, but yeah, naughty is like cheeky or something. I mean, it's cheeky monkey. Anyway, we see this language of yoking as well as an image of the law in 2 Corinthians 6. Do not be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship or partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, right? So the understanding that unbelievers are under the sway of that lawless one, and those who are pursuing wisdom and the way are being led towards righteousness. What communion or koinonia has light with darkness? What accord? Symphonesis. That you can guess what that is, right? Symphony, working together, sounding together. Has Christ with Belial? So this is where we see Belial being referenced directly in the New Testament. Again, doesn't have to explain who Belial is. Drops a perfectly good kind of Hebrew Aramaic word in the middle of a Greek text and doesn't have to blink an eye to explain it, because they all knew who he was talking about. Or what part has the believer with an unbeliever, and what agreement has the temple of God with idols? And of course, the idols represent the pagan religions that
Is unbeliever a good translation there? Because it would seem that, we are encountering people who do not believe. Are we talking about people who are radically opposed to belief?
well, I'm going to look it up real quick
I was wondering about it too.
because I want to see what the Greek says.
She compares, I think, what accord
Yeah.
has Christ with the light,
Yeah.
but
It's 15. Yeah.
it would be unfortunate if he
Yeah.
wants us to see anybody who doesn't believe are fellow human beings.
Yeah. So it's a pisto with an apisto. So pistevo is like I believe, or
Obviously, without faith.
yeah, untrustworthy. Yeah, a believer, trustworthy, faithful, believing, and apisto, untrustworthy person or incredible thing. So,
It's used.
yeah, it's like one of those things, Father. Yeah. Father Damick always makes the point in the podcast that a lot of times where we're presented with a word that seems to be referring faith or belief, the way modern Americans tend to read that as like an intellectual assent to a set of propositions, right? An intellectual faith. But what it's actually talking about is faithfulness in the Greek, and that's a good example there, right? If it means trustworthy versus untrustworthy.
But I still don't understand how, if you're talking about symphonicity.
Yeah, what symphonies would Christ have with Belial? How would they work? How would they speak together? How would their, how is there any kind of accord between them? Or are they perpetually locked in
But
an arm wrestling match?
Is this how we are in relation to people who are opposite? I mean, then wouldn't we be constantly like,
Right. And I think that's why I'm saying it's not about simply a person who doesn't assent to a set of ideas. It's about somebody who's, intrinsically kind of untrustworthy and lawless and rejecting any kind of faithfulness, right? It's not simply ignorance.
Right.
It's like willful, right? It's a willful type of darkness. Right, like a heretic versus a heterodox, right? Heretic is somebody who, having received the faith, decides their opinion is better no matter what, and
Let them be accursed.
Yeah.
So, anathema, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not simply a person who's been hurt and damaged by the way religion has been presented to them and now are rebellious against that false image of somebody who has actually experienced Christ and then turned against.
So that person may end up going and doing a bunch of things that they wish they hadn't. So even if they're leaving in the first place was kind of justified, they might still end up going in that way. I'm just saying, just because, we give them grace, but we also recognize we're all still responsible for what we do with our lives.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
But I was talking about in terms of what he's saying.
Yeah.
In other words, what part has a believer with an unbeliever? I mean, in America right now, there are
surrounded by unbelievers in that sense, right? Yeah.
But a lot of them are people who are reacting to a false presentation
Yeah.
of the gospel.
Yeah, and exactly what I said in my sermon. Like, of course, I have to work with people who don't think or have the same ideas all the time. How do I actually ever get anybody new into the church if I don't, right? I mean, it's just that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about this willful rejection. Because
how would that be reconciled with love thy neighbor? I know that's or is love thy neighbor
well, even sometimes when you love your neighbor, you have to kind of withdraw from them, right? If they're walking in a way of lawlessness to their own destruction, you don't want to get sucked along in the whirlpool with them, right? So
would it be that with Christ that was kind of modified, that the concept of
a lot of people treat this as having to do with marriage, but this is not actually in the section about marriage. The section about marriage says kind of the opposite. It says, how do you know if if your husband or wife doesn't believe, how do you know that through your faithfulness, you won't sanctify them? So by your good example, you'll win them. So you're already yoked with them in marriage. You don't throw off that yoke. You actually bring it to the Lord and hope for the best. But this is talking about like, don't getting put under the nomos, right? Don't getting put under the way of life of the pagans. Keep your way in, with integrity.
But it's the way it's often used, by evangelicals, is, and I'm not putting down evangelicals, I mean, they're doing the best interpretation they can, but they'll say you shouldn't be friends with unbelievers or, even friends. I'm not talking about all of them.
Yeah, because for them, like fellowship and communion are shaking hands and having a donut or something. I mean, they don't have that liturgical way of identifying the boundaries of community in the same way as the ancients did. It's like, be your friend is one thing, going to your temple and eating the sacrifices to your God, or having you come and participate in the Eucharist and not being baptized, those would have been shockingly, opposed things in the ancient world, because you can't do that. But you could certainly be friends in the kind of the everyday sense of the word, for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I've heard people talk about, not going to weddings of family members who aren't believers.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and what does that prove?
Yeah, or not inviting unbelieving family members.
Oh, they're so judgmental.
Yeah, it doesn't, it really just gives everybody a bad taste in the end.
And once again, I'm not talking about all evangelicals. That is how I've heard some evangelicals.
Well, there's some, yeah, you find that everywhere. Right? It's kind of and that's unfortunate. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. That's part of the whole point of this, right? We're against spiritual powers. Those people who might be under the sway of those things need God's help as much as we do. And therefore, why would we withdraw from that opportunity to be a light in the darkness? So not a great strategy. So, but I know what you mean. Now, the second part of the verse that we're looking at, the final part, is he's called also the son of destruction. Also, you will see that listed as the son of perdition. I put up here the icon that I saw. I've seen it. I've used this icon, and I don't know if it's from the same church, but I was actually in the church where this icon was in Seattle, the Seattle area. It's the Three Hierarchs Romanian Orthodox Church, and they have this in the altar. And in the center of the altar is the table, and Christ is giving communion to his holy apostles. And kind of there's like 6 on each side, but on the right side, Judas is shown turning and going out the door, right? But notice what he left behind. Yeah, he's got a halo there that is facing Christ, but he's leaving it behind.
Oh.
So this is part of the idea. Judas is an example of the son of perdition, the one who was lost or given over to destruction. So John 17, while I was with them in the world, I kept them in your name. Those whom you gave me, I have kept, and none of them is lost, apoleto, except the son of perdition, apoleas, that the scripture might be fulfilled. So Judas becomes kind of the fulfillment of the type of the son of destruction, who is lost, who falls away because of this. But this is not a new concept, as it says, that the scripture might be fulfilled, right? So you're going to find some evidence of this in the earlier scriptures in the Old Testament. For example, in Isaiah 57, are ye not children of destruction or children of perdition? Apoleas, a lawless seed, anomon, sperma, sperma anomon, a lawless seed. So this concept of you're good for nothing, kids, because but you're heading towards destruction. And then in Revelation we see the locusts that are one of the plagues had a king over them, the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon, which comes from Apoleto, Apoleas, right? Apole, it's the same word in Greek, destroyer, destruction. So in the Greek, he has the name destroyer. Abaddon is destroyer. So the son of destruction is not simply, again, somebody doomed for a bad fate. They are, but it's the implicit understanding is that they are somehow spiritually tied with the spirit of the destroyer, the spirit of destruction. They have been given over to that power, as Judas was. Now, son of, a gun, or other phrases are a good example of how in English we use the term son in this similar way to anthropos, meaning representing a whole. So, for example, we have the son of the Father in Christology. He is the image, or he is the image, the express image of his person, the Son being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person. So to be the Son of God is not simply talking about somehow a generative relationship. It's also talking about in imaging relationship, in a relationship of likeness. You are your father's son. You don't say that to somebody because you mean your dad begot you. You're saying it because you're just like him. You are your father's son or your mother's daughter, this kind of concept. St. Barnabas, for example, Joses, who is also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement, but actually in Hebrew is more correctly son of prophecy, was a Levite of the country of Cyprus. So Josie Barnabas, the son of encouragement, doesn't mean his father's name was Nabis. That's what they're trying to say. They're saying that he was a type or an image of encouragement for them. He was an embodiment of encouragement for them. Barabbas, the son of his father. So when we say he's his father's son, that bandit who was given in place of Christ, at the trial, right? Who do you want? Jesus, the Son of God, or Barabbas? And that would have been a pun, right? Because Barabbas is son of the Father. In fact, according to one early tradition and relayed in Origin, Barabbas was his patronymic, his last name. So his first name was actually Jeshua too. So Jesus, son of the Father, was the name of a robber, essentially. And he's the one who was set free, whereas Jesus, the actual son of God the Father, is the one who suffered the criminal's fate. So yeah, but this Barabbas is like, also could be kind of like a nickname, like he's his father's son, like he's a chip off the old block, he's just another bad kid. And John 8:44, you are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. So this is Jesus tearing in to the hypocrites that are criticizing him and saying evil things about what his ministry is about. And he's calling them out. He's saying, you're not sons of Abraham, you're sons of the devil. And as I mentioned earlier, Cain is the archetype of the wicked man. So he's also a son of perdition type, if you will. And lastly, because you should always look in the Lord of Spirits for references to giants, Noah's prayer in Jubilees chapter 10, Noah prayed before the Lord his God and said, God of spirits and of all flesh, we still use this phrasing in our memorial services, who has shown mercy unto me and has saved me and my sons from the waters of the flood, and has not caused me to perish as thou didst the sons of perdition. The sons of perdition who died in the flood were the giants, gigantes, the sons, the Nephilim, the sons of the Watchers and the Fallen and all that stuff. So go check out the Giants episode if you don't know what I'm talking about there. There's a whole really long episode on giants in the Lord of Spirits, and it's mentioned all the time. So, and they are always talking about how these phrases and terms would make really good heavy metal bands. And I found out that yes, Sons of Cain is a heavy metal band. So I'm giving them a shout out for anybody who likes their black metal. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the first half of episode 90 something of Lord of Spirits, Antichrist, Devil's Children. Next week, we'll go into then who is now we kind of like get this idea of this man of lawlessness context, what the spiritual dimension is about him. What is he actually going to do that's going to reveal him? The specific kind of action of the Antichrist. With the knowledge then that there's still going to be many figures throughout history who will do the exact same kind of things and be kind of mini Antichrists along the way. So in any case, if you enjoyed tonight's class and you're watching online, feel free to visit our parish website, make a donation. You can also text. And of course, if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe to St. Mary Orthodox Church. At this time, I will end the slideshow. I will take off the life. And anybody who has questions is very welcome